whether it means discounting some of the debt on the market, whether it means also some better terms for new borrowings or cutting down the interest rate. In a strategy for a country like Mexico, there must be some leeway at some point, and we don't have it yet. And this is producing in Mexico a desperation, because it's 6 years of adjustment, of belt tightening. You can be very moral about it and say you still have corruption, you still have this and excessive expenditure here and there. Every country has. But there has been
It is a pleasure, on behalf of the Living History program at Duke University, to interview one of the sesquicentennial scholars who are lecturing at Duke in the spring of 1989. Our visitor today is Professor Victor Urquidi, a distinguished Mexican economist and educator. Professor Urquidi received his early training at the London School of Economics and returned to Mexico in September 1940 to join the Mexican Central Bank's research department and to teach at the National University. In the 1940s, he participated at a fairly young age in international conferences, including Bretton Woods, and began his deep and consistent interest in Latin American development in close touch with Dr. Raul Prebisch of the United Nations Economic Commission on Latin America, and later, Professor Urquidi served as a staff member of the Economic Commission on Latin America in Mexico, in charge of Central American integration. Professor Urquidi's deep academic bent led him to collaborate from 1963 in the building up of the social science programs at El Colegio de Mexico, which is one of the foremost research and postgraduate training centers in Latin America. There he helped develop various programs while conducting his own research and publications. In 1966, Professor Urquidi was elected president of El Colegio de Mexico. He has held this post until September 20th, 1985, a period during which El Colegio has established a solid reputation for scholarly work throughout the world. Professor Urquidi's interest broadened not only in terms of social science approaches to development, but also in terms of geographical scope. He has traveled widely and participated in seminars and conferences in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as well as with organizations in advanced industrial nations. In 1980, Professor Urquidi was elected president of the International Economic Association, the first national of a developing country to become president of that organization since it was founded in 1950. He set about organizing an intense program of roundtable conferences throughout the world. During his tenure as president, Professor Urquidi visited 37 countries and stimulated interest and participation in the work of the International Economic Association. Professor Urquidi's long dedication to development issues has evolved in a framework of non-conventional thought in the light of the reality of Latin America and later Asian and African issues. His path has been that of research and writing and helping to train new academic staff rather than that of direct participation in governmental or intergovernmental bodies. Nevertheless, his writings have influenced views held in third world countries along with other leading Latin American scholars and authors. I think it would be best first to welcome Professor Urquidi to this interview. The two people who will be conducting the interview with Professor Urquidi are Professor William Ascher of the Institute of Policy Studies at Duke University, and myself. My name is Gereffi, and I'm a member of the Sociology Department at Duke University. Professor Urquidi, it's a pleasure to have you here with us, and I think maybe we can begin our discussion with you by turning the floor over to Professor Ascher.
Thank you. Professor Urquidi, you probably have a unique perspective on the role of international organizations in Latin America, having worked both at the World Bank and then at the UN Economic Commission for Latin America. Could you begin by recounting how the UN Economic Commission developed such a distinctive approach to development policy for Latin America?
Since this is an attempt to say something of historical interest, I should go back to how I heard for the first time about the UN Economic Commission for Latin America. I was then a staff member in the World Bank and in the economic department. I was the head of the Eastern Latin American division. The World Bank had divided Latin America into Eastern and Western for some unknown reason to me. But being a Mexican, I could not be allowed to work on the Western part because that would involve Mexico, and the policy was that you didn't work on your own country's problems. So I was put in charge of the eastern parts, which put me in close touch with Brazil, Venezuela. Colombia was judged to be east. It's a very arbitrary situation. Anyhow, I was there and learning of the World Bank's early approaches to lending to the Latin American countries. I had been at Bretton Woods, therefore I knew all the background of the creation of the fund and the bank. And I worked in one of the commissions precisely on the creation of the bank at Bretton Woods. And so I was very interested. I thought this was a chance, by going to the World Bank, to learn of, well, how the bank was going to help development in the different regions of the world, including at the time, of course, Europe, because the bank was set up as a bank for reconstruction and development. Then the Marshall Plan, of course, superseded the World Bank's efforts at reconstruction, and the bank went more and more into what was vaguely called development. At that time, there was a development committee at the United Nations, and I had been asked to join a subcommittee. And the World Bank didn't like that very much. They thought it was not quite compatible to be in the World Bank with whatever its philosophy was, and to be at the same time as an independent member on a personal basis in the UN subcommittee. So I did go to one or two meetings, I wrote a report, and then they said I'd better withdraw from there. But my contacts at that committee and the subcommittee led me to the knowledge that something was brewing, that there was going to be an organization from the UN to assist and support Latin American development, patterned somewhat on the commission set up for Europe, the Economic Commission for Europe. I didn't know what was going on, and finally it was created, as you know, in 47, the end of 47, the ECLA, UN Economic Commission for Latin America. And shortly after, I received a visit from an Argentinian who worked at the UN Secretariat, who came to me with the proposal that I should become the first executive secretary of ECLA, which was to be based in Santiago de Chile. And this caught me totally by surprise. I had only just got a few months before into the World Bank and was learning all these issues and getting involved. And then I thought, I'm too young. I haven't got enough experience of dealing with governments and, you know, getting into the big wheels of United Nations activity and so on. And then I finally decided, well, fairly quickly, that this was too early and I wasn't the right person for that, even though I had already written something and I was known as one of the few economists, certainly in Mexico, that had something to do with Latin American affairs.
How old were you at the time?
Well, I was 28, 29, so I thought they needed somebody more mature for that kind of work. I was the youngest delegate at Bretton Woods, absolutely the youngest of all, 25. And then I continued at the World Bank. This was a bit of a frustrating experience. I did participate in negotiations with Brazil, especially because the first loans were to be made to Brazil. And I did not, of course, on the negotiations with Mexico, but I heard about them all the time from both sides. And then there were some reorganizations, and I got shifted into other departments, other sections, and finally I decided to go back. Meanwhile, the UN appointed a Mexican, an economist, Martinez Cabañas, as the first executive secretary of ECLA. But at first, they saw it as a bit in the League of Nations tradition, an organization that was to put together all the information about what was going on in Latin America, a good economic presentation of the current situation. Statistics were rather poor in those days. The UN system of national accounts hadn't been set up yet, and so to put together figures on national income in Latin America and everything else was pretty difficult. The OAS had some background, you see. The OAS, which was, remodeled in 1948 at Bogota, had a secretariat, the Pan American Union, which already did put together a lot of information, but it was very run-of-the-mill, descriptive kind of work, and no ideas were behind it. I think what was interesting in ECLA was the possibility that some deeper thought could be given to development strategy. This was what came out of the Second World War, what to do about areas that were known to have rapid population growth, that had resources, that were already in the process of some industrialization, and how were they going to relate to the rest of the world, how were they going to change their structures, how was the outside world going to help them, especially given the existence of the World Bank. That meant access again to foreign credit. However, the start of ECLA was very unauspicious because of the lack of understanding, the rivalry between the two secretariats, the OAS and the ECLA secretariat, and the governments behind them. Chile at that time was the country that pushed ECLA. In fact, ECLA was a creation of Hernan Santa Cruz, who was a Chilean delegate to the United Nations at that time. And well, he's written this. There's a beautiful description, account of how he achieved the creation of ECLA with not too much support from countries even like Mexico. See, the weight of the OAS, of the Pan American Union, was still very strong, and many countries were reluctant to get involved in a controversy with the United States by creating a separate organization within the UN system when there was a regional organization. This is a very bigger problem than I'm making it sound, because at one time there was some thought that the OAS could be a regional branch of the United Nations. And there's a lot of literature on this to show why it wasn't proper. And the OAS had its own existence, its own purposes, but the United Nations was something else. There was the Charter, and the Charter foresaw a number of actions in the economic and social field which didn't have to coincide with what the OAS was about, and the way especially the OAS was handled in the management of inter-American affairs. So that ECLA started up as a kind of dissident organization, and it gained immediately the support of younger generations of economists who suddenly appeared on the scene, like Furtado and Jorge Ahumada in Chile, and many others who didn't have much to say for the OAS in a sense, nothing wrong either, but who wanted to do something new. Now, I myself had returned to Mexico after my almost 2 years at the World Bank. 49, I joined the Ministry of Finance in development issues at once, and then at that time there was a change shortly after in the ECLA, whereby Raúl Prebisch, whom we knew as a central banker, and I had personally worked with in Mexico in the 40s, became the executive secretary in ECLA, and Martinez Cabañas was displaced to technical assistance in New York. But Prebisch had already shown his mettle and his frame of mind, his conceptualization of Latin American affairs by an extraordinary paper that he presented for ECLA at the first ECLA, second really, conference in Havana in 48. Which he was allowed to present with his name on it, which is against the usual way of doing things to the United Nations. He was a consultant to the ECLA, and his name appeared. He insisted very much on that. But these were his ideas, his interpretation of the problems of Latin America, economic problems, of its relation to the outside economy, to the world economy, through exports of basic products, the declining terms of trade theory, and the notion, which was very interesting, that the export pessimism, that is, that you couldn't expect too much in the way of development of prices and world markets for basic products as a basis to sustain the development of Latin America. Therefore, you had to industrialize, and this meant necessarily protectionism and government orientation and intervention, because you could not rely on the markets for basic products. Well, as it turned out, I've said this later in papers I've written, the 50s turned out to be a most prosperous period for basic products. But anyhow, the movement towards import substitution, industrialization, was already on its way. In fact, it had started spontaneously in the 30s. It had developed during the World War II period. And then it was resumed in the late 40s and 50s, especially after the adjustment, the 47, 48 recession and adjustments and so on. But all this fitted together and gave Prebisch the opportunity to be heard at this Havana meeting. I didn't attend it, but it was sensational to have this message from a Latin American economist. So this enabled him to get support to become the executive secretary of ECLA. And this is where I came in shortly after, because I was then involved in a study with the World Bank and the Mexican government on Mexican development prospects and how the Mexican strategy fitted in with the notion that some foreign capital should come in to help development, and this was where the World Bank could play a role. And I was finishing that study when Prebisch set up a conference of ECLA in Mexico on the new issues, especially, at a time when the American government was very anti-ECLA and wanted to finish its mandate, saying that there was the OAS, Economic and Social Council, and that was enough for Latin America. And it was a touch-and-go business. Has been recounted in many books, including a recent autobiographical book by Celso Furtado in Brazil, how Getúlio Vargas finally put his weight on the scales and determined the continuation of the life of ECLA on the appeal of the Brazilian delegate and a few others who were with him. Well, I'm saying all this because this led to the creation of the Mexican office of ECLA, and Prebisch asked me to join it, and I was delighted. It's just the right moment at that time for me in my intellectual development, in my interests, in the fact that I wasn't easily being absorbed back into the Bank of Mexico and other organizations in Mexico, to the fact that I participated in this big study on Mexican development with the World Bank and the Mexican government, to which very few people paid any attention, and that I understood the issues. And then he said, this was a surprise, but we're going to work on Central America. Would you like to do that? And I said, yes. I had lived in Central America as a child. I knew Central America a little bit. So I devoted the next 7 years to that. Therefore, you find, in answer to your question, a relationship with at least what I did in the World Bank with what ECLA was about, although that does not mean necessarily that the World Bank and ECLA saw eye to eye on many issues.
How early did the conflict arise between the World Bank and ECLA on the question of protectionism and on the question of export pessimism?
Well, I think that came much later. I think the problem, see, the World Bank has been and was then run by bankers, US bankers, and bankers from Western Europe and other countries who had very similar approaches. The bank in those days worked on a project-by-project basis. For example, the first loan to Brazil for electricity was judged to be good finally, after many studies and difficulties with the borrower's finances, there was a Canadian company, Brazilian Traction. But they thought it was a good idea to lend money to Brazil because it was private enterprise, not because they thought that electricity was a major component of a Brazilian development strategy, whatever that was at the time. And this was the approach on a country-by-country, project-by-project basis. No thought was given by the World Bank in those days to the world economy and how Latin America or a Latin American country fitted into the world economy, what was going to happen to prices and so on. But these noises were coming from ECLA about terms of trade, about protectionism, import substitution. I don't think the World Bank even had anybody who knew what was import substitution in those days. All this came later, much later. So I'm talking a kind of prehistory of the World Bank, the first few years, you see. And meanwhile, since the OAS had no real response to the economic and social needs of Latin America those days, and no real thinking behind it all, well, they didn't allow the economists and others to come out with their ideas, Prebisch had a free hand. Now, the State Department didn't, because of the OAS issue and others perhaps, didn't take too much to the approaches that Prebisch was presenting, which were nationalistic, protectionist, dirigiste, as the French say. I mean, government intervention, planning. The word planning was anathema in those days. So he invented a new one, programming. And this was the key word in all the discussions later. But this went against the grain of, you might just say, the conventional wisdom about economics, about trade. For example, the notion of that came from Cordell Hull and others before, you know, the free world trade was not acceptable, incidentally, to the Latin Americans. At the Chapultepec conference, William Clayton had gone there and said, the war is over, no more long-term contracts on basic products, open your economies, reduce your protectionism, and the market will take care of everything, and let in foreign investment. Well, there was a tremendous reaction to that. I wrote a paper on that, it's in my bibliography. And this was the line followed by the US government. I'm talking of 45, but it continued through the years, through 47, 48, 50, and so on. So a clash of sorts, an intellectual clash, you might say, was developing between ECLA and its planners, and Prebisch with his ideas, and others who supported him, and the thinking about Latin America going on, especially in the United States. I don't think Europe was very involved. Europe was very distant at that time. But I wasn't in that. I was in the middle of that because I got involved in the Central American development issues, where, you know, that region was always thought of by the United States as a kind of backyard, and you didn't want interventions from United Nations organizations and people with ideas from the outside.
Before we turn to Central America, I'd like to ask about the relationship between ECLA and the idea of an international trade organization, which was aborted. Was there ECLA support for the ITO?
No, I don't think ECLA had any views on that at that time. See, we're going back to 48, the proposal to create the ITO at Havana again, out of which came GATT. I don't think ECLA had any views. Prebisch at that time had expressed his views on Latin American development. They were nationalistic, they were to create autonomous policies. They were, because of pessimism about world markets for basic products, and especially prices of them, he was very much in favor of giving more support to import substitution with whatever necessary protection could be applied, which meant, of course, implicitly not abiding by the theory and the policy that was behind the creation of GATT, and which was also partly in the background for the International Trade Organization, which never came to being. I should add here, because Prebisch was very much maligned later by saying that he was in favor of you know, protection to the limit and so on. He wasn't. He was very clear, and this is quoted in writings of Albert Hirschman. Prebisch warned very much against the excesses of protectionism. You know, he was in the tradition of Hamilton and Liszt. And then what came afterwards in the interwar period, there was a Romanian economist, Manoilescu, who I'm sure Prebisch must have read, who also argued that protectionism helped industrialization. Now, but these ideas were not just Prebisch's, they were arising in a spontaneous way in Latin America. In fact, Latin America was always protectionist in the 19th century. Now, how to make this, out of all this something more organic, more structured, in relation to an overall view of development, this had never happened before. And this, I think, was the great contribution of ECLA to give consistency to all these ideas, however much they were later attacked by many from the outside.
Well, it seems at that period when ECLA was putting forward these ideas that there were two great issues. One was this issue of protectionism and how you could use that to build up industrialization. The other issue was the issue of the role of foreign capital. And in the book that you mentioned that you participated in, which was published in 1953 on Mexico, what do you see as having been the key issues you had to grapple with in that report with regard to the role that foreign investment could play in Mexican development?
Well, first let me say that I think the key issues we tried to bring out of that report, which was written by four people. One of them was Albert Waterston from the World Bank, Jonas Haralds from Iceland, whom I knew, and a Mexican economist at Nacional Financiera, Raúl Ortiz Mena, and myself. The key issues we were concerned with were the structural change in the Mexican economy, the move towards industrial development, the need to improve agriculture, the need also to develop resources. We were very critical, for example, in that book, that report, of the policies of Pemex, the Petroleum Corporation of Mexico, because they weren't forward-looking enough. Mexico was going to need energy, and nothing much was being done about it. But we did realize, because of the nature of Mexican foreign trade and the institutional factors and so on, that Mexico was in a stage where the rate of savings could not be large enough. Whenever efforts were made through good policy by the government and so on, and by household attitudes to saving and so on, and business savings, to sustain the rate of investment that we thought necessary to keep raising GDP per capita in Mexico, where population was also already growing at a fairly high rate. So that we clearly saw that Mexico would need a net inflow of foreign capital. Nobody thought of the large amounts in those days. In today's terminology, we would say we're thinking of something of the order of 1 to 1.5% of GDP as a net inflow of foreign capital. Now, what happened in the past? Foreign capital had come through loans in the 19th century, which were in default and were only settled in the mid-40s. So Mexico had no access to the securities market, to any borrowing, except from the World Bank. And the World Bank, in turn, as you know, was financing itself partly from the capital markets, especially in the United States, and so that those who bought World Bank bonds would like to know what the World Bank was doing and how it was lending its money. So they had to be very cautious. They had to be very good projects. But this was thought of as one source, especially for electricity, port development, railroads, highway construction, infrastructure, as we now call it. The notion that foreign investment, direct private foreign investment, would return to Mexico in large amounts was not really considered very likely. First of all, in the past, most of the investment had been in the petroleum industry, which had been nationalized, so that was out. Whatever the arguments or the case for trying to attract again foreign investment into oil, but it was not acceptable politically in Mexico. The electric power industry was still private, but but they were subject to the control of electricity rates, and this is why they went to the World Bank, the Mexican Light and Power Company, and a Mexican government corporation at the same time, in 48 or so. And in industrial development and in agriculture, foreign investment was practically also out because of land reform and many other nationalistic policies in Mexico. So it left industry and services. Well, this was very small then. Mexico was not a big market. Mexico was not competitive internationally. It had done some exports during the wartime period. These were a bit accidental and marginal. And Mexico had begun in the 40s, during the war, to set up some parastatal enterprises to develop steel, to develop pulp and paper. There was an interesting private investment in the production of small fractional power motors. One of the US corporations set up with a Mexican bank. So that was a new form of private investment. But there weren't all those opportunities, nor was the Mexican policy very open to foreign investment because of the past experience. Still, you might say that with some restrictions, 51% Mexican ownership, that sort of thing, and others, Mexico was willing to accept proposals from foreign investment to set up business in Mexico. We already had automobile companies, of course, and they have remained until this day 100% foreign owned, those that were already in, because Mexican law is never retroactive. It only applies from the moment it's enacted, but it doesn't change the basic principles in the past. So that this World Bank report, it's not a World Bank report, it's a report of the combined Mexican World Bank Working Party. We did recommend a small stream, a net inflow of foreign borrowing, foreign capital through borrowing, and conditions that would favor foreign investment, but we're not going overboard and saying that's the solution to the problem. Our strategy is that the main effort had to come from Mexico, as it should be.
It seems that, as you pointed out, the initial idea was to get a relatively small amount of foreign investment, but in some cases, perhaps the flow actually exceeded the expectations of the people who were thinking about a foreign investment in the 1950s. And by the 1970s, that inflow of foreign investment seemed to have given rise to a set of criticisms that were brought together under the rubric of dependency theory.
But you're taking a big jump. Okay. 50 to 70 is a long span. If we're talking of the early 50s, yes, there was some foreign investment, because here you find a bit of a trap in the import substitution strategy. That is, the moment you start determining protection, then the multinationals jump over the barrier, set up a subsidiary, and operate from inside the market and benefit from that protection, but without any intention of exporting. Mm-hmm. It's only now, today, that the multinationals are exporting from Mexico, and that the Mexican policy is now favoring certain forms of foreign investment provided they export. But in those days, the protectionism was given alike to whoever produced, and it was thought that if the multinationals came in and produced household appliances, for example, or set up Sears Roebuck, as they did at a certain point, it was all to the better. They would improve the lot of Mexican suppliers. It would bring in technology. It would bring in some foreign exchange. It would help modernize industry. It would set an example to some of the rather obsolete national Mexican industries. The government was too afraid of, say, domination by multinationals in certain areas. It was very sensitive to it in mining and petroleum or anything to do with resources, where the question of sovereignty immediately comes, especially in Mexico, comes to mind because of the fact that the Mexican Constitution determines that all natural resources belong to the nation. You see, even the subsoil. This was the great controversy going on with the oil companies, that subsoil belongs to Mexico. Whatever you do on the surface and getting the oil out is something else. So there wasn't much opposition. And it did contribute to employment. Mexico was sensitive at that time, talking of the 50s, to the need to increase the rate of employment. Migration was already beginning to the cities, partly what we now call the push factor, the poverty in many rural areas, or instability or uncertainty and so on, the struggle between the ejido system and the private property system, and the difficulties of implementing land reform legislation and programs, and partly the fact that past a certain threshold, a city like Mexico City was becoming very attractive as a place where people could get education, access to health services, modern amenities, and so on, and employment. Because historically, Mexico City and Monterrey have been the main industrial centers of Mexico. And the market was there in the center. So where do the enterprises go, the multinationals? Where do they put their new automobile factories or their new household appliances? In Mexico City, which offered tax incentives, maybe all the wrong things as we judge it today. But these were incentives to attract industry to the Mexico City area. Now it's a plague, to provide employment. And you got this cumulative process. The more employment was created in the central area, the more people came in search of employment. Then you establish schools and training schools to enable them to get employment. And until we realized much too late that this was going too fast and too big. Anyhow, some other industrial centers have been established, throughout the country, and many of the multinationals have been given incentives, as well as the Mexican companies, to put up their new plants in these new areas. So, as you might say, what you call the dependencia attitude and the opposition to foreign investment mounted, it was really much later. Mm-hmm. It was much later, I think, in the late 50s, after the Aleman administration. There were always tensions with foreign investment, but it was at a time when the left-wing groups began, nationalistic and left-wing groups began to realize that certain industrial branches were beginning to be dominated by foreign capital. For example, this is anecdotal almost, but we had a very good canning plant for Mexican chilies. A man called Clemente Jacques. He was of French origin, but of these French who went and settled in Mexico and so on. He had this wonderful plant producing chilies. You know them, I'm sure you've tasted them. It wasn't an export industry, by the way, but only for domestic consumption. One day, this factory was bought out by a multinational. So now it happens that all the basic foods you see in the supermarket, cornflakes and the baby foods, and the chilies, the canned chilies, and many other things are produced by multinational corporations. And the canned milk and the powdered milk and everything. Coffee, instead of roasting our own coffee and grinding it, we began to take Nescafé, a Swiss company producing powdered coffee in Mexico, and so on. This is a sort of thing that was like fuel feeding into the nationalist feelings and the left-wing groups, which led, I think, to a lot of opposition to foreign investment, but did not change government policy. Mm-hmm. Government policy in Mexico was managed, like many other things, with some beautiful principles laid out in the law, and then a pragmatic case-by-case approach in practice, so that the door was really fairly open to foreign investment with Mexican participation in many cases, but many exceptions to this day. So, I would say, I used to argue in the late 50s and early 60s, when I wrote about all this, that the main contribution that we should seek from foreign investment, direct foreign, was a technological contribution. Because I didn't think, I had an intuition about it then, it was proved right, that Mexico was doing enough in education, enough in supporting research, not even that there was enough understanding of what was going on in the outside world to make some breakthrough in technology or various technologies in Mexico that would enable Mexican entrepreneurs to do something new and be competitive. And that the contribution from foreign direct investment, I didn't think it was important financially. I didn't think it brought many hundreds of $millions every year. And we had access to loans. You see, the loans from the World Bank and then later the Inter-American Bank created the infrastructure without which the economy couldn't function. Better roads, better improvement of railroads, better ports, better electricity supply, and so on and so forth. But the technology we could not produce. We had to bring with the foreign investment. Now, you can say, yes, every machine we imported incorporated new technology. And the know-how of these foreign corporations, mostly American, but also some Canadian, some German, some French, some Spanish, some Dutch, etc. Their know-how was an addition to the Mexican technological base. But we are not doing enough on our side to absorb, to innovate, to be more discriminating about technology. And because of monetary policies, it was for any enterprise, whether a subsidiary of a foreign corporation or a Mexican company, cheaper always to bring in the technology from the outside than to try to do anything in the way of research and development locally that would do something. And you get into these issues of the kind that I epitomize with this example. Suddenly, multi-speed blenders came into Mexico. And they were produced naturally by foreign corporations. All the well-known trade names are on them, trademarks. And Mexican families of lesser resources, lower income groups, who used to grind their corn every day on a metate, who would grind their chilies for their sauces in another little stone thing we call a molcajete, all of a sudden jumped to the blender. Now, first we had a single-speed blender. Fine. It meant a lot of saving of effort for the housewife, the poor housewife who was minding children and cooking and going to the market and grinding corn and for the tortillas and so on. But all of a sudden, modern technology produced the 8 or 10-speed blender. And the advertising was all in that direction. And we went to these very sophisticated blenders, which cost a lot of money, and people bought on credit and so on and so forth. But they didn't need them that fast. This is a worldwide problem. I mean, it's the old problem that the Chinese speak about. I mean, do you go to the high technology all at once, or do you walk with one leg with the old technologies and the other leg with the new technologies? We jumped to the new technologies much too fast at a very high cost and neglected to produce, in my view, the simple consumer goods that people needed to improve their households, but that didn't involve much expense. I have a recent example which is fascinating. A relative of mine produced a very simple fan. It's a one small fan, this size, one speed. You plug it in and you get, and it's good for all our warm climates in Mexico. You don't have to go to air conditioning everything in the tropics because you have breezes. And in the old days, we relied on nature, and you have fans. He produced a simple fan. Now, if you go into a store in Mexico, you ask for a fan, you're offered a very sophisticated fan, now even an electronic fan. Very expensive. In Mexico, you may buy them here in the States at these depots where you buy all kinds of hardware at a very low price. But in Mexico, you pay 4 or 5 times the price for the one made there by the same companies or similar companies. And there's a lot of markup in the distribution and so on. My friend, my relative, had no success in trying to sell this fan in Mexico. He developed it with some engineers, very simple. He got a big contract from Cuba. because they needed a simple fan, not a sophisticated fan, for many household uses. And they weren't producing it. They may eventually, maybe they do by now. So this is the kind of issue that fits so nicely into the mindset of those who say foreign investors don't understand our conditions, foreign companies are just here to exploit the market, and beautiful advertising and with beautiful blonde, blue-eyed girls on television announcing all these gadgets when the people of Mexico are neither blonde nor blue-eyed and don't need those gadgets, you see. So this is a cultural problem, cultural, political. In practice, I repeat, Mexico has given a fairly good welcome to foreign investment with full guarantees of property. The expropriation of the oil companies in 1938 was a one-time affair.
Did ECLA ever take positions on these issues?
No. ECLA couldn't. ECLA did, however, within the framework of ideas developed by Prebisch and the people who worked closely with him in Santiago, developed some schemes about development strategy, which were more or less of the kind that we all know. I mean, there should be programming several years ahead. There should be a stimulation of domestic savings, but access to foreign capital, essentially to loans. I don't think the ECLA people in Santiago favored foreign investment very much, direct investment, but borrowing in a moderate extent, yes. And there should be import substitution, and there should be, since you cannot do everything, the market is limited, you have to choose basic industries or other industries or whatever was necessary according to the needs of, say, Argentina or Peru or Uruguay or Brazil. ECLA in Mexico did not have a very strong influence, but there had been some studies by Prebisch and by some of the people that were certainly influential among economists and others. And then there was one study that created quite I would say, a rumpus in the series of studies on development country by country. Prebisch said, well, what about Mexico? I said, we should do one, a new one. This was mid-50s. And I said, I'm not equipped in Mexico to do that because I'm concentrating on Central America. But if you could send some economists from Santiago, we could do it. So we had Furtado, we had Zunkel, we had Noyola, a Mexican who had been in Santiago and joined the office in Mexico, and a few others, and I sort of supervised the whole study, but I left them quite free to develop their own ideas. Now, curiously enough, they tried to be original. They didn't try to apply the more or less the model that Ahumada and others had developed, which was being used for Colombia, for Peru, even for Argentina, and so on. They tried to be more original, to understand many of the characteristics of Mexican development that were possibly different from other countries. At least in Mexico, we always think we're quite different from all the rest. You know that. And they came out with a study which turned out to be very critical of monetary policy, of the last-minute resort to devaluation as a means of correcting the external imbalance, but which inevitable because the policies led to that, but which in turn determined distortions in the follow-up, in the development of the Mexican economy after that. Now, this study came out mainly as a critique of the 47-48 devaluations, which were agreed with the IMF and so on. And it came out just when Mexico had again devalued in '54 and set a new course of industrial development and so on. And the answer that the Furtado and the group gave in this report, well, fine, but this is not improving income distribution. This is not leading to a basic solution of Mexico's problems. And it's not a policy that is advisable for the future. Now, all this was said in very cautious terms. But two things happened, very important. First of all, Prebisch didn't like the study. It wasn't the sort of study he would have written. I was a personal witness to a 3-hour confrontation between Prebisch and Furtado. The two titans opposed when they originally had worked together. And I in the middle, because I was involved with the Mexico office and I had supervised the study and I had responsibilities towards the Mexican government, in which they disagreed totally. Prebisch didn't like the study, but it was there, and it was going to be presented at a conference of ECLA.
What aspects of the study did he disagree with?
Well, it's hard to tell. It's in a sense, it was that it wasn't the Prebisch originality, it was a new originality within ECLA, coming out of the mind of Hurtado, which did not coincide with the way Prebisch looked at things in general. I think only a psychiatrist could unravel this one. In Furtado's autobiography, published a couple of years ago, he relates this scene, not in all the detail that I remember, but he does say that there was this final confrontation in which he was in total disagreement with what Prebisch was saying. Prebisch wanted a very set piece, and Furtado gave this very unorthodox approach on putting more emphasis on the way Mexico handled its external disequilibria. Well, Prebisch knew also by then that the government of Mexico was not pleased with the study. And I'm sure he had received phone calls and things. It sort of undermined not the policies, but maybe it exposed the weaknesses of Mexican policies in the external field, in the management of the exchange rate and things like that. And when the report was delivered at the conference in La Paz, the Mexican delegation, of which I had no control, attacked the report. It was never published. The only one of all the development studies of CEPAL that was never published. What I did is I went straight back to Mexico and I printed 1,000 mimeograph copies and sent it around everywhere, and I had it translated into English because I thought it was very important. So there you had some tension within ECLA, and I would say the beginning of questioning what were we talking about? What kind of development? Could you apply a model, a theory, the Prebisch theory, whatever it was called then, to all Latin American countries? Maybe you could take certain notions from it, but each country had its individuality. That was the lesson to me. At the same time, I was very proud that a group of economists had acted very independently, with intellectual honesty, even knowing that this was not going to be very well received by certain quarters in the Mexican government or in elsewhere. So that that was a very interesting moment of tension, almost a break in the trends. Shortly after that, I resigned from ECLA, and Furtado resigned also. I resigned for other reasons. I wanted to go back to Mexico, to Mexican affairs, and I was a little bit frustrated and tired of the Central American experience. Furtado had other ideas in mind, I'm sure.
You've described how ECLA established a number of principles, probably in relation mainly to the larger countries in Latin America. And then you were responsible for implementing ECLA policy, or developing ECLA policy for Central America. To what degree were these broad principles applicable to the Central American case?
Well, before 1951, ECLA had no connection with Central America at all. Oh, somebody had been around there gathering data and so on. But in 51, with the setting up of the office in Mexico, of ECLA, it became a major part of the work of that office not because ECLA invented the idea of integration, because the Central Americans themselves, who had this idea always in their minds, this long history of attempts at integration in Central America, and certainly even unions and things, customs unions, trade treaties, they thought that the most objective and careful way to go about integration was to get the United Nations, through ECLA, involved in helping them. not through their own organizations, which always led to squabbles and problems and political issues, difficulties of all kinds. They had an organization of Central American states, which just didn't quite function. So that they presented the draft resolution at the Mexico conference of ECLA in '51, to which Prebisch responded very, very readily. And this resolution was passed, adopted, and it established two things: the responsibility of the Secretariat to do the studies to help the Central American governments with the process of integration and to give orientation and guidelines. And second, to act as a Secretariat to a committee within ECLA composed of the ministers of economy of the 5 Central American republics. So this was the UN mechanism. We were the Secretariat. That's when I, shortly after, joined the ECLA office. And then we started thinking, well, what do we do? What is integration? Well, we had the examples of all the free trade zones and ideas that had been used in many parts. We had some vague notions coming from South America and so on, but nothing very structured. As you know, the Treaty of Rome didn't come into being till 58. At the same year that the first Central American Free Trade Treaty and Integration Treaty was adopted. So we had to work on very little and accept ideas about customs unions and so on. Well, we thought, after surveying the Central American situation, here are countries that are dependent on coffee, cocoa, cotton, lumber, some a little bit of lumber exports, and sugar, and so on. They are in the same boat as all the other Latin American countries. Weak markets, weak terms of trade, etc. They hardly have any industry. But they're not earning enough foreign exchange to pay for imports that they might need, just for consumption or for development. They have very low rates of savings. They have a need to improve their infrastructure. They need electricity power. They need ports. They need railroads. They need roads, everything. How are they going to finance all this? So we thought, in the structural change scheme of things about development in Latin America, these economies were too small to do it each one on their own, number one. Secondly, historically they had links. There was a little bit of trade among them. They had a few free trade treaties or treaties of different kinds which tended to create exceptions to the general trade policy. Could this be developed? And we very soon came to the notion that if they could treat the whole region as a single economic unit with all the provisos and qualifications that requires, they could pursue a policy of industrialization and development, I mean, including agriculture, including infrastructure, with the notion that if they added their 5 markets together, they would have at least a growing domestic market that would give sustenance to some of that development. If they could export manufactures, say pulp and paper, for example, fine. But this wasn't the immediate purpose. In fact, the ECLA doctrine, if you want to call it that, didn't envisage very much in the way of exports or manufacturing. I'm talking of the 1950s. So this happened to fit in fairly well with the ideas, especially of Salvador, which had treaties with 2, 3, or 4 countries. We did a trip with Prebisch through all the countries. We realized there were enormous difficulties. You had a left-wing government in Guatemala, the government of Arbenz, with certain overtones of Marxist thinking and very strongly anti-American feelings and so on. You had a pragmatic government in Salvador, and a key figure there, an economist called Jorge Sol, who died last year, a rather extraordinary person. I think the only man who, in those days, was sort of a statesman in Central America, and who understood the whole issue. You had a very weak Honduras, as it is today, but also then, which was really run by the United Fruit Company. I mean, you felt the weight of this banana republic approach to development there. You had a dictator in Nicaragua who was the old Somoza, the father of the other Somoza who the Sandinistas toppled. And then you had a very nice, placid and quiet democracy in Costa Rica, which had had its problems when Figueres took arms to defend democracy and so on. And then you had Panama on the sidelines and a bit distant from the others, and you had to take it into account, but you knew that Panama would not be a part of the Central American scheme because they didn't regard Panama as part of them. Well, this is the sort of political atmosphere we had to contend with. But we started our work. We produced a guideline document at Tegucigalpa in 1952, which was adopted. And from there came, through the minister's sanction, the Committee of Economic Cooperation for the Central American Isthmus, as we call it in Spanish, the sanction for all the work on integration, which included a free trade treaty, an equalization of the external tariff, a program to suggest which industrial branches were worth developing on a wide Central American market basis, and not on a country-by-country basis, taking into account what was already in the works. I mean, a cement mill in Salvador and some textile factories in Costa Rica and so on. And also the improvement of communications. We got a UN mission in to make a 2-year survey of transportation in Central America, which we discussed in every country with the ministers, with the experts in transport and so on, to encourage the linking of the economies by better highways, by improving their ports and railroads, by air services, by many things, and also, following the European example, a Central American treaty on, well, the French call it circulation, that is on transit of trucking and other forms of road transport across borders. Because you could drive from San Salvador to Guatemala in about 4 or 5 hours, driving time, but it took you 3 hours at the border. And if these were trucks, it might take them 24 hours to cross the border. So we did all those things. We also thought of technology at an early stage. And there was a Venezuelan working with us, Mayoveri, who then later became executive secretary of ECLA. And he and I produced the proposal to create a Central American Institute for Industrial Research, which was eventually established in Guatemala.
What year was that established?
Well, the idea was born in 52, it was approved by the ministers, and the institute was up around 56, 55, 56, with support from the 5 governments and from the United Nations and so on. ICAITI is the name of it, Instituto Centroamericano de Investigación Tecnológica Industrial. We also helped, but the idea came from headquarters, UN, came from Martinez Cabañas and some other people working there for him, to set up an Institute of Public Administration to train government officials in Central America on the spot, including the idea of integration, customs, procedures, and everything. That started out under the name of ESAPAC in Costa Rica, and I helped draft the basic document that was approved by the ministers, and then it changed its name to ICAP, Instituto Centroamericano de Administración Pública, and it's very successful, and it's still going. So we had the idea that you had to create institutions that would bind the countries. You had to create a great many committees, subcommittees. We had one on energy, we had one on housing, we had one on agricultural cooperation, with the help of FAO and other organizations that were involved in that. We had a very fascinating committee on industrial projects, which was not made up only of government representatives, but of private business groups as well. And we had a sort of consultative basis just to talk about, well, what were the proposals? What could you do? Do you really think you could have 5 factories producing the same product, one in each country? Or could you reach some agreement and have one factory in Guatemala and another in another country and have access to the whole market? One of our economists in Mexico, Cristobal Lara, came out with a notion, I'm sure he got it from some book of philosophy or something, saying 5 markets, the sum of 5 markets, the integrated market is more than the sum of 5 markets. It's a philosophical concept. I think he was right. There was an added dimension to all this. Now, to do this, you can imagine dealing with Somoza. I once had an interview with his son, after Somoza had been assassinated, and his son, Luis Somoza, became president. He's a nice man. And we were having to organize one of our meetings about industrial integration, and there was we needed an instrument, a document, a kind of a convention on the planning of industry in Central America. And he said to me, look, Victor, he said, it's very simple. I can convene here in Managua the leading industrialists of Central America, and we could just tell them where to put their plants, what to do, how to build them, etc. I said, Mr. President, my limited experience in Central America tells me you can't do that. They're not going to pay much attention to you in the first place. We have to operate institutionally. We have to create legal mechanisms. We have to create treaties. We have to build up the notion that this is good for the good of Central America. But nobody is going to stand in the center and say, you do this and you do the other. And he accepted the idea.
Professor Urquidi, I wonder if we could switch to a discussion of the educational sphere, since I think one of your great contributions in Latin America, in fact, has been your role in founding and establishing El Colegio de Mexico as a premier research and training institution. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that got started and some of the experiences during your 20 years as president of El Colegio de Mexico.
Could I go back a minute to Central
Please,
America?
sure.
Because I think we got cut off there. Well, the eventual result of all this was the first treaty, which was a very difficult one, a negative treaty in a sense, because it said free trade will be allowed in the products listed in Annex 1. We had to negotiate those one by one. We had to negotiate the tariffs. I sat in on many meetings on that. This didn't quite work out. And also, the US didn't like it. The US was not involved in all these discussions, and when they became aware of what was going on in the State Department, they went to Guatemala and Salvador and Honduras and said, why don't you three countries sign a treaty among yourselves, absolute free trade, and forget about the Central American integration thing. And there was another aspect, and they did. There was another aspect, which was that we wanted a sort of planned industrial development for Central America. This was bitterly opposed by the US State Department, because this is against the principles of free enterprise and so on, and it involved protectionism and so on. So this in the end was dropped. But in 1960, I was no longer in ECLA and the head of I wasn't there. They did a different treaty. They had said everything is free trade except a list of products which would be negotiated and so on. And that was much better. Now, there were other problems. Then came the devaluations of the currency in Costa Rica and problems between Costa Rica and Honduras and Salvador. Nevertheless, as you would see from the data, intra-Central American trade rose from 4% of the total trade, from $4 million, to $1 billion in a few years. And it became trade in manufacturers. Now, many of these were the products of multinationals that went in there because of the larger market. Others were development of a local nature. Well, then came the 69 conflict between Honduras and Salvador and the so-called football war and many other things. And, well, I won't go into that history. I was no longer in it and so on. But now we can go back to this because we also thought of education in Central America. We had a UNESCO mission helping us to compare the educational systems and see what could be done to enlarge the area of reciprocal acceptance of students, of graduates from universities, recognition of degrees, development of the universities, and so on, and training schemes which the ILO helped with some ideas, some experts. So I was interested in education already then. Now, let me go to your question. As an economist in my early days, I was associated with a publishing firm, Fondo de Cultura Económica, mainly doing translations. But the head of the Fondo, Mr. Cosío Villegas, was also involved with the Colegio de Mexico. He was the secretary, the secretario, the deputy president of the Colegio de Mexico, which had been established originally as a small institution to receive the Spanish Republican intellectuals, professors who could not do their work during the Spanish Civil War. As you know, a few days ago was the 50th anniversary of the entry of Franco into Madrid. But before that, it was apparent that they could not go back to Spain. They had been invited by Mexico. This special organization called Casa de España México was set up for them. So before the end of the Cárdenas administration, this was transformed into el Colegio de Mexico with the notion, well, let's have a Mexican institute. There's something patterned in the Collège de France. And for anybody who wants to do freely, today like many institutions in the United States, Brookings and others, his research on whatever he likes to do, mostly in the humanities and social sciences. And out of that came seminars and things, and I used to go to them as an economist. If you started discussing the future of Latin America, you had participation by economists, political scientists, many others. Prebisch was in one of these. When he was in Mexico at the time, in the 40s, he wrote a remarkable paper on what he called the vulnerability, the economic vulnerability of Latin American economies and monetary and foreign trade policies. So we had very good discussions. We even had early discussions of integration. Javier Marquez, a Mexican of Spanish immigration origin, wrote a very useful paper which he called economic blocks, because that was a term used in those days, bloques económicos, long before the common market idea of Europe and so on. So we had all these discussions. I used to participate, and I came straight out of the London School of Economics into research, and then continued in research in ECLA and so on, and World Bank. But this was, I discovered, this was really what I liked, academic life. But it didn't exist in Mexico in the sense in which it exists now, that you can devote your full time to it. So I had all these other jobs. I learned a lot. And I helped develop there a Center for Social Studies. It was multidisciplinary. We had a Spanish sociologist, Medina Echavarria, running it. We had leading professors from the UNAM, from many parts. I used to teach economics and demography. And it didn't last very long, had not much support. Later in the 60s, after I'd been again in jobs in the UN and so on, and back and forth, I was again invited to teach, to help set up, rather, a school for international studies at the Colegio, and to teach a course on economics. We thought they should start by learning some economics, macro and micro and so on, which I did. And then the notion came up, why don't we set up a center for economics as such, and for population studies, which was beginning to be an issue in Mexico. So I helped with all that. And at one point, after several years of working in the Ministry of Finance as an advisor to Mr. Ortiz Mena on Alliance for Progress issues and development issues and forecasting farm product supply and demand for farm products and many, many other things, I said to him, I would really like to go now fully into academic life. And well, I'm sorry, but let me go. And he did. And I was replaced by someone else as his advisor, one of his advisors. And I went to El Colegio to devote my full time with other Mexican economists and sociologists, to set up the program for economics and demography and the research that had to go with it.
How was that funded?
It was funded mainly originally by the Mexican government, and I used to have the advantage of my connections with the Minister of Finance to be able to bypass the Ministry of Education, which was not very cooperative, and by the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations. We got some very, very good support at the right time. These were not big amounts. That enabled us to improve our facilities, to hire staff, improve the library, to get things going. Once you do that, and you begin to show some results, and we had cooperation from the French Institute of Demography, for example, in setting up the population studies. And once you do that, you get the ball rolling, and you have leverage to get funds from other sources. And I used to go to the Mexican Minister of Finance and say, look, we've got all this money from, not a lot, from Rockefeller and Ford, but can't you match it? Of course, he said. You know, you touched
Yes.
a nationalist feeling there, say, well, this should not be financed by outside organizations only. And so we got UNESCO support for some things too. Well, we got this going. And out of economics and demography developed sociology. Out of international studies developed Asian and Middle Eastern studies. And later, much later, I added Sub-Saharan African studies. Then we had the traditional groups of linguistics and literature, Hispanic, that is Spanish language, linguistics and literature. We had history, and the history department is a very strong one. It's one of the oldest in the Colegio. And we moved it in the direction of contemporary history and not just 16th century, which is fascinating, but doesn't tell us much about modern life. So we had a lot of people who got interested in contemporary history. And at one point, somebody, Mr. José Villegas, had the idea of writing a serious history of the Mexican Revolution. An objective one, not who are the good guys and the bad guys, but let's go into all the documentation, the archives that are available in Mexico, in the United States, in Great Britain, etc. And we produced a 23-volume set of books after a number of years with this history of the Mexican Revolution until 1960. And that brought people very close to the work of the economists, because we economists knew about the 50s and 60s, but we didn't have the approach of the historians. But they knew very little economics. We were able to work together. And same with political scientists who knew the recent political developments of Mexico, but didn't have the same methodology of the historians, so they joined forces. And this taught us that in the Colegio, set up with few departments, with full-time staff, with total dedication and proper support, you could develop interdisciplinary work. At least you could cross disciplines and produce something of much greater depth and interest than if you just followed a narrow disciplinary approach. Now we had students, the Colegio always had students, and in the 60s, 2 undergraduate programs were established, international relations, and a number of graduate programs, which were history, economics, later came in sociology, population studies, plus the linguistics that was traditional. And this developed over time. Now, my approach to the Colegio was, I don't know, unconsciously I must have had some kind of British model in mind. It had to be a center of learning, but more than just a place where people in isolated fashion in their cubicles just wrote things and gave lectures and so on. It had to be a place of discussion, of programmed development of learning, that we couldn't cover everything. We had to choose. So let's have some areas within history, some areas in economics, not everything. Some areas in sociology. Sociology came out of demography, really. Migration studies. Why do people migrate to the city? Out of that came the first sociology program, and then we went into other aspects of sociology of education, for example, political sociology. And if you dealt with international relations by training people at the undergraduate level for whatever work they may want to do in the Foreign Service or anything else, you inevitably went into two areas, which were political development in Mexico. If you assume that foreign policy is an expression of domestic policy, or that they interact, and also Mexican-American relations. So a lot of emphasis has gone at the Colegio into U.S.-Mexican relations. And we were the pioneers. We were pioneers in so many things that it's a long list I couldn't tell you. But then we had imitators, fine. If the moment other universities started having U.S.-Mexican relations programs, excellent. More knowledge, more depth, better coverage. The moment another institution set up an economics department, as we had, delighted. I didn't see it as competition. This was our purpose, to have a multiplying effect. Now, we had our own standards. Colegio has very few students, today not more than 300. It selects them very carefully. It puts them through admission tests and interviews and so on, and grants them a small scholarship to survive, so they don't have to get on to little jobs here and there and divert their effort and attention from study. And the study system is very intensive. It's semi-tutorial. There are not, big lectures, professors lecturing to 500 people or 250 people. Small groups and seminars to follow up. And it's very successful because with the choice of students from all over Mexico and from other Latin American countries, and we've had students from the US and Canada, from Japan, from France, from many countries, who may come for a full course or a year or two or some period. We have also visiting research graduates who come to do the research on Mexico with us and go back and get their degrees, for example, in India, from India, on Latin American affairs. And if you have this choice of students and full-time, carefully selected also faculty, you can change things. You can do what toute proportion gardée, as the French say, a British college could do, or a department in an American university can do, which we couldn't do before in Mexico, because education, higher education in Mexico is being seen as a part-time occupation. Part-time students, part-time faculty. No good libraries, just rote learning from the lectures given by the professor, who may be so lazy as to just follow one single textbook, his own, or maybe some translated one. And that's it. And you pass exams orally. So our system is totally different. It's very much more like the way you work here in the US or in Great Britain. Better than the French, I would say, except maybe some of the elite schools of France. Anyhow, we are an elite center, not in the social sense, because our students may come from any social level, provided they can qualify. We are elite in the sense that we are creating staff, academic staff, and staff for public service, and also private service, why not? And many do go into private activities, of a good level of qualification. Now, we cannot provide everything, therefore, they can go to PhDs in other countries. We have our own PhD program now in sociology, in population studies, in history, but we don't have it in economics yet. We haven't dared do it. Now that we have enough PhDs in economics on the faculty, maybe we can move to that next stage of PhD in economics. This requires more resources, and there are none at this moment. The population PhD we established with support from the Rockefeller Foundation. That's very useful. So we send people out, and our graduates do very well in foreign universities. They're at the level of graduates from any part of the world. And this is the purpose, to show, first, that we can do it. Second, that we need it. We'd like to have imitators. We have some. I think we've had an influence in the national university and other universities, with a lot of critique too, because since we don't take political sides, we don't go out and make statements about United States or Latin America or Peronismo or whatever. We're out of that. We are academic. We give the trained people to know what's going on, but we don't encourage they want to, they can do it if they want to go out and make a statement in the press or whatever, but we don't, as an institution, take positions on political issues.
As an institution, do you engage in research projects along with the government of Mexico?
In many cases, we have had joint research projects, or we have had projects for the Mexican government on a very autonomous basis, on the condition that they can be published, not as a private consulting kind of thing. We have had joint projects with other universities throughout the world, with other research institutions in Mexico. We're very flexible. The Colegio is extremely flexible, but it has a norm. That is, there must be good methodology, strict academic standards, and not try to have any advocacy of this or that or the other through its research. We've had some very interesting projects with Japanese institutions, for example. And because of our Japanese studies, we have developed such things as a manual for the teaching of Japanese to Spanish language speakers, done jointly with the Japanese. But we've done many other things. Recently, we were engaged in a study on export promotion policies with the Japanese Institute. I participated, that's why I know about it. And we have UNESCO-supported projects, many international organizations, OECD, we have seminars, we're outgoing, we send people to conferences and congresses throughout the world, or we used to send them. I say it's much more difficult now because of the lack of resources.
Well, that was my next question. Any institution that decides to combine research along with training runs the risk of having the research funds dry up.
Yes.
How has El Colegio tried to insulate itself from the vagaries of the Mexican economy and the availability of resources?
We had a period of very fortunate support by the Mexican government. See, we're funded 85% by the Mexican government. The Colegio is a non-profit corporation set up by the Mexican government and other institutions, but with no interference. There's a board of trustees who are independent. And there's a sort of top-level kind of once-a-year gathering of the founders just to review accounts and give general approval. But this system gives a lot of leverage to El Colegio because in addition to negotiating its grant from the government, it is free to obtain funding from outside sources. So we've had funding from foundations, from international organizations, even some private business grants in Mexico for certain projects that they thought might be interesting, not necessarily for their own profit. And the Colegio has benefited from the good times in Mexico. Under President Echeverria, he gave us a lot of support without any interference. On the contrary, we were very useful to him, but from our own research. We developed all the analysis that led to the adoption of a population policy in Mexico in 1973-74. But we'd been working on this for 8 years until somebody paid attention to what we're producing. We were instrumental in the urban development policy in Mexico and the decentralization idea for future urban development and so on. We were instrumental in setting up or clarifying the whole problem of migration, of undocumented migrants from Mexico into the United States. We weren't the only ones, but we started it. Then we joined forces with other organizations. We helped develop the free textbooks for primary school children in Mexico on the social science history side, the civics side, and the language side. Other institutions did the science and mathematics. So we were on our own, not because we were asked to, but we were helpful in things useful to the government of Echeverria. He in return supported us with a new building and with budget support. No conditions, no strings attached. I can vouch for that. Then came the next government, and we had very good support as long as the oil boom lasted. The moment the oil boom collapsed, started collapsing in '82, we were in trouble like every other university institution in Mexico because we're treated as a university. And we saw our real income go down. We saw our real wages go down as much as 50%. in a few years. And there's no funding for new activities. The Colegio, like others, have had to shrink and eliminate projects that were financed from outside sources. Some of the research has gone under. Now, we have a rather important distinction to make. In the Colegio, the faculty, who are not too many, around 150, 160, and spread over many fields, the faculty are not obliged to teach if they don't want to. You can join the Colegio as a researcher and just do nothing but research. You can write articles, books. If you want to run a seminar, have a seminar, you can do it. If you're asked, can you teach a course on this or that for one semester, you can say yes or no. You're not compelled. So this gives us a basis for research, you see, paid by the Colegio. You're on the staff and you do your research. I'm in that position now, but I'm almost an emeritus. I mean, I was president and I can do more or less what I want, but I do research essentially. But last year I was asked, can you teach a course? I said, yes, this happens to be the kind of course I'd like to teach. So I resumed my older interest in a course on Latin American development. It was very useful to me, and I think useful to the students. But I'm not compelled to do that, and nobody else is compelled. Now, if you get extra funding, you can then hire short-term researchers, assistants. You can have money for surveys, for travel. You can associate a lot of things to a research project, like purchase of books for the library. You can get a computer or some additional computers in under the research project, and that sort of thing. That has dried up a bit. So I think it's essentially, given the financial restrictions today, it's essentially a question of having a little imagination and sort of seeking out new sources of funding. When the restrictions came in, we had a problem with the library. You see, suddenly books became very costly in peso terms. I mean, imported books, and even national ones, but imported ones, subscriptions, and our budget was shrinking. And then I said to all the directors, we have to find people who will finance our purchases. And one person had the bright idea to go to the US Embassy and said, can you help us finance the purchase of US books for our library on literature and linguistics? And the answer was yes, an immediate grant of $1,000. And so on. You see, you have to seek out these sources. We're too used, in a sense, to saying, oh, well, we get our budget allocation, we manage it the way we want, the Board of Trustees approves it, and we spend the money. When there was less money, then people thought of new ways of raising funds. And so there have been many sources of that kind. Now we have a new thing. We have 2 endowed chairs. One by a Mexican bank on Pacific studies, that's of interest to you. And the other is on literature. And it was endowed by the widow of a former Minister of Education, former Director General of UNESCO, Mr. Torres Bodet, a great poet and writer. She wanted to endow a chair with very few conditions attached. She wanted, of course, some reference to the work of Torres Bodet and so on, which is legitimate research and so on, but not to glorify his name necessarily. But it's called the Jaime Torres Bodet Chair. Well, this is new in Mexico. It's very rare in a public university, because we are a public sector organization, to have money coming in from the outside with no strings attached, except, say, this is for a general area that we call literature, we call Pacific studies, and so on. I think we may get more of that in time. Now, the Colegio has a great deal of interaction with government, with business, with other institutions in Mexico, with outside institutions. In that sense, it's unique. With Latin America also, although the distances, it's more than the physical distance. It's the inward-looking nature of all the Latin American societies that prevents a real open contact with Latin America. besides it's very costly to travel and to maintain contact. We used to have some of it. We had the Latin American Social Science Council, which incidentally I helped establish with some support from the Ford Foundation originally. And there are other mechanisms, but that has been restricted in the last few years. Now, the Colegio also looked inward to Mexico. We thought, we can't grow. We will cease to be El Colegio if we just doubled or tripled or quadrupled and, kept getting bigger and bigger. So why don't we develop issues, the study of issues and programs in the Colegio, and then shift them out of El Colegio to appropriate organizations? Well, the short story of it is that there are 6 colegios, additional, not run by El Colegio de Mexico. We participate in some of them by helping with staffing, by helping with the libraries, by supporting the research, by interacting with them. But they are all based on local initiative in various states of Mexico, and all respond to the local needs, to the local regional issues, and follow their own programs. There's one on the border, for example, in Tijuana, which is very successful because they have really made a study of all the issues that relate to the border, from migration to health to disposal of waste to industry, maquila, and to connections with the American universities and so on. And they have publications, they have also dissemination, very good videos that they send around. And it's good academically. Now, my only reproach to these colegios, and there's one in Sonora, and there's one in Jalisco, and there's one in Michoacán, is that they should not concentrate exclusively on the local regional issues. They should also have the national scene we're pushing this decentralization and regionalization too far. If we create an institute far in the interior of Mexico, and the distances are large, it takes you 2 or 3 hours flying to get there, and they study the local issues and don't study the national issues. Why leave the national issues to those of us who live in the federal district? That's wrong. But anyhow, this idea is moving, and I think we will see more colegios as soon as more funds are available. When I left the presidency of the Colegio, I had already made contact with about 4 different states to set up similar organizations on a small scale. One in the southeast of Mexico, one in San Luis Potosí, one in the state of Mexico, which is nearby, which was eventually created, and one in Puebla, which was created but has had some problems and is not quite on its feet. And there were some other preliminary talks. Well, I think that as soon as resources become available, and there's an idea now to set up one in Monterrey, these things can be done. And this is, to us, very important, because whatever the merits of the Colegio idea, that you have full-time, serious, rigorous research and training, and total objectivity, you can reproduce it on a small scale and set the example. You see, if we have been an example to other institutions in Mexico City that have followed more or less our pattern, with variations and their own ideas and so on, we can also do that in the interior. If we set up a colegio, small colegio in some provincial capital, very soon the local university or some part of it or some other institution will say, well, this is a good thing. And this goes back to this basic problem, what are we trying to do with higher education? And I maintain, and this is what I was talking about yesterday, that you have to meet the broad mass demand for education. You can't avoid it. Unfortunately, it's going to be met in a very mediocre way. It's going to be quantity and not quality. Quality is declining, and there are not enough resources to have enough full-time faculty in all the universities to do that. Well,
why is there?
But you can do it on a smaller scale in colegio-type organizations, or in special institutes, or in organizations where the private sector would be willing to contribute, so long as they don't get involved in the mass education problem and the politicking and the corruption that goes on there and so on. So this is a real issue that has to be studied for the future in the long term.
Why has there been no successful effort at establishing a middle-sized university in Mexico?
Well,
you have UNAM with 300,000
yes.
students, El Colegio with 300.
No, there are some. The UAM, the Metropolitan University, was established during the Echeverria administration, and I took part in the early studies on that. And the idea was a very good one, is to create an alternative in the Mexico City area that was to have not more than 15,000 students. It now has about 50.
They say 100,000.
Maybe 100, yes. But it has various characteristics which are interesting. One, it does not have high schools incorporated into it. I mean, you have to know a lot about the Mexican educational system to understand this. The National University runs high schools, the baccalaureate, the equivalent to the French and Spanish baccalaureates and the English A-levels, O-levels, and the upper part of the high school. And it also incorporates, it certifies a lot of private schools who run their own preparatorias and says they are incorporated in the UNAM, in the National University. Now this gives some privilege to the graduates of these high schools, especially the ones run directly by the UNAM, because they can then go directly into the UNAM without any admission exams, which is a terrible thing because it lowers the standards and so on. Now, the UAM, the Metropolitan, was created without any baccalaureates under it, so that they could choose students coming out of the baccalaureate, what we call preparatoria, on basis of merit and entrance exams. First. Secondly, the UAM was to start with 3 campuses, separate, different parts of the city. Thirdly, it was to start with a high percentage of full-time faculty. Fourth, it was to be a credit system syllabus, that you could take a major and a minor, which is unheard of in the National University. If you're going to be an economist, forget it. You can't even take a course in literature or history. You have to just follow the syllabus of economics, and that's it. 5 years. Too many subjects. I mean, 10 semesters, 9.5, 10 semesters. In the UAM, you could do it by stages. You could take summer courses and add credits. Very much pattern on the US system, certain US systems. This was a wonderful idea. It's been corrupted by the general mediocrity and approach to university education in Mexico. It's become politicized. There is a union of professors and administrative employees, which is controlled by the Trotskyites. Now, what has happened, in spite of the efforts made by the rectors and the local chancellors, standards have declined, admission requirements have fallen, politicization has introduced its ugly head into studies, especially in the social studies. Ideologies have crept in, little groups have been formed, and it's not what it is. It's not a quality system. So it's better than many schools in the National University, and certainly better than many provincial universities, which are even worse, much worse. But it's not what it was intended to be. And this was supposed to be a medium, small-sized university. And you have a few good provincial universities, the Veracruzana, for example, especially certain fields. You have some good things in Guadalajara, the Nuevo León, Monterrey. I'm talking about the public universities. Then you have a lot of private universities in Mexico of different sizes. Some are good, some are really tailored to a particular demand, or they're business. And some are no good, absolutely no good. Now, for the Colegio, you see, to isolate itself from this environment is a very difficult problem. It's an issue. I mean, you are accused of being either elitist or being run by the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and all these terrible people up in the imperialist country to the north, or you're accused of being pro-government, which we are not, or you're accused of being anti-government, which we are not. Is a very little understanding of what is a center of excellence. I'm talking of the social sciences. It's less controversial when you're talking of mathematics and engineering and things like that. But a center of excellence, a center of learning, a place where you're not trying to tell people how to think, but just to think, to do research and learn, and to think. That's all we do. So that's our role. If we can reproduce that on a small scale, fine. It's not going to solve the national problems.
Yes. Professor Urquidi, in some of your recent research, you have been focusing on the issue of external debt in Mexico, and it seems to be looming as one of the big problems that a number of Latin American countries are confronting. And I wonder if you could share with us some of your thoughts on the perspective of Mexico with regard to the debt issue, and whether that's of major significance or whether it will decline in importance in the coming years.
Well, I'm afraid it's of major significance, but it's no use now to go back and say, why did we become indebted? We did. And, I mean, whether we use the money wisely or not, we can spend years of research and discussion about it, whether it financed capital flight or whether it financed new industries or whether it made Mexico an oil exporting country, and which it did, or whether it was used for other good social purposes and so on. It's bound up also with tax policy and why we didn't have good fiscal policies. It's bound up with the notion that why was it easier to borrow from banks than to make a savings effort at home, and so on. Many other things. It's bound up with trade policy and many things. But there it is. We have the debt. And to me, the issue can be narrowed down to the following. It's not the debt itself that's important. I don't even look at these figures which try to give ratios of debt to national income, debt to GDP. I don't know what it means if you don't disaggregate the whole thing. It's the interest payments. As long as we have to transfer interest, the transfer of interest is a two-stage affair. You have to create the resources within the country in pesos in order to convert them into dollars or other currencies to pay the interest to the banks. Well, again, when you look at the debt, you have to leave on one side the debt to the World Bank and the Inter-American Bank and that kind of multilateral, and the official debts, because they have special schedules, they have easier terms, they have lower interest rates and many things, and you assume that that money has really gone into identifiable projects and so on. It's the debt to the banks, to the commercial banks, that is a problem. So that the interest to the commercial banks, which is high, it's higher than historically it has ever been. Even today, there's a real rate of interest of 5 to 7%, 6 to 7%. Historically, it was 3. And can you keep on doing that if you don't have a growing source of foreign exchange independent of borrowing that will enable you to finance this interest? Now, you could say, well, you could borrow to pay interest. This is exactly what we've been doing. I think it's a long-term strategy that can't succeed. You can't keep becoming indebted more and more, even on the best terms, you know, fraction of a point above LIBOR or something like that, or prime rate, just to pay interest, unless you get some leeway that enables you to increase your export earning capacity. Now, let's look at the export earning capacity of a country like Mexico. Well, for a while it was oil, until, well, in fact, until 1985. It started declining in 81. 82 was a very bad year because of all the convulsions and devaluations and financial chaos and so on. There were restructurings of the debt in 83, 84, 85. In 85, Mexico didn't borrow, but suddenly the price of oil collapsed. And Mexico lost 1/3 of its export earnings in a few weeks. In fact, it lost almost as much as it would have had to pay in interest on oil alone. Now, it recovered a bit in 87. It went down again in 88. It's recently recovered a little bit again. But what Mexico has done, therefore, is to stimulate non-oil exports, which means essentially manufacturers. Because agricultural products and mining products are a very small fraction of the total, in spite of the export of strawberries and tomatoes and things like that. It's the manufacturers that are important. Now, what we have gained in exports of manufacturers, we have lost in exports of oil. So we're in the same situation overall. I know that the aggregates don't tell everything. You must look into the deals. I think it's much more important that we become an exporter of manufactured products than that we're a big exporter of oil. It creates more multiplying effect of income, employment, and so on. So Mexico's problem is how to transfer the interest, which is a problem in itself. It's the magnitude of it. And I don't think we've reached the stage where we can handle it without some debt alleviation of some kind, as is being talked about now, whether it means discounting some of the debt on the market, whether it means also some better terms for new borrowings, or cutting down the interest rate. In a strategy for a country like Mexico, there must be some leeway at some point, and we don't have it yet. And this is producing in Mexico a desperation, because it's 6 years of adjustment, of belt tightening. You can be very moral about it and say you still have corruption, you still have this and excessive expenditure here and there. Every country has. But there has been a real belt tightening, a real decline in income standards, in living standards, in real income of the lower income groups especially. And there must be a way out of it. So this is how I see the debt problem, and I don't see an answer to it if there is not enough cooperation forthcoming and understanding in the developed countries and the international organizations. Then Mexico will be forced to take some unilateral measures of some kind, because you cannot keep transferring. Now, the internal transfer is in a sense even worse, because Mexico has implemented a policy to reduce inflation. Mexico's got rid practically of inflation. Certainly it's less than 2% per month now, but at the expense of repression of demand internally, cutting down public investment, cutting down, even discouraging private investment, but borrowing constantly to pay interest on the external debt. Now, the internal borrowing, when there was inflation, was very cheap. Now that there's no inflation, the internal borrowing is very expensive. It's costing the public sector a real rate of interest of at least 20 to 25% per year. Real rate of interest. To borrow internally to pay the 9 or 10% interest on the external debt. And this, of course, feeds into inflation, discourages investment, crowds out borrowers from the banking system. It's the worst possible situation. Still, without it, we couldn't keep inflation down. Without this policy of repression of demand and high rates of interest, real rates, in order to discourage capital flight, but it doesn't encourage investment. It encourages people to put their money into very safe government securities and certificates of deposit and so on to earn very high interest. You can earn 50% interest on practically a sight financial investment in Mexico, which, discounting the current rate of inflation, is about 20% real for the year.
Well, I think we could be
it's crazy.
Discussing these issues far, far longer.
Well, that's my concern. That's my interest in trying to clarify this problem.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid our time has drawn to a close, but I would like to once again express our appreciation on behalf of the Living History Program at Duke to Professor Victor Urquidi for sharing some of your thoughts and concerns and insights with us. It's been a very, very valuable experience.
Well, thank you very much. I've been very honored by this invitation, and I'm very happy to participate. And also, I think I've reached the age where I should start reflecting on what I've done and what I'm involved in at present.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Good.